The 80s gave us some absolutely legendary movies that were perfect for their time. But if you tried pitching these exact same plots to Hollywood executives today, you'd probably witness some very uncomfortable silence, followed by security showing you the door. These 8 films are perfect examples of why nostalgia sometimes needs a major reality check. Big proves that the 1980s had a wildly different understanding of appropriate romantic relationships, because somehow a movie about a 12-year-old boy having sex with an adult woman became a beloved family classic that won Tom Hanks an Oscar nomination. Josh Baskin is a frustrated kid from New Jersey who makes a wish at a carnival fortune machine to be big and wakes up the next morning in an adult man's body, fleeing to New York City, where he lands a job at a toy company and quickly rises through the corporate ranks thanks to his childlike perspective on what kids actually want, all while developing a romantic relationship with his coworker Susan, who has no idea she's sleeping with someone who was playing with action figures just weeks earlier. What makes this production fascinating is that Tom Hanks initially thought the movie would go straight to video and worried about his career, while the iconic piano scene required building a massive 16-foot keyboard that Hanks and Robert Loga spent weeks learning to play with their feet, refusing body doubles because they wanted the authenticity that somehow didn't extend to questioning the ethics of the central plot. Behind the scenes, the casting process was absolute chaos, with Steven Spielberg originally wanting Harrison Ford, then cycling through Dennis Quaid, John Travolta, and Robert De Niro, who was actually cast before dropping out and nearly derailing production entirely. The film's romantic subplot would be immediately flagged by modern audiences as deeply problematic because regardless of Josh's physical transformation, he's still mentally a child engaging in sexual activity with an adult, creating consent issues that would spark outrage from child protection advocates and probably result in the script never getting past development executives today. Director Penny Marshall glossed over the serious psychological trauma of a child suddenly experiencing adult responsibilities and relationships, treating the whole situation as whimsical rather than the identity crisis and potential abuse scenario it actually represents, making this feel less like innocent 1980s charm and more like a movie that accidentally normalized statutory rape. Mr. Mom turned the idea of a man doing housework into a 90-minute comedy goldmine. But Michael Keaton's Jack Butler wasn't just changing diapers and vacuuming carpets. He was accidentally pioneering what would become the most outdated gender comedy of the Reagan era. The plot follows Jack, a Detroit auto engineer who loses his job during the early 80s recession and has to become a stay-at-home dad, while his wife Caroline, played by Terry Garr, goes back to work as an advertising executive, leading to domestic chaos as Jack struggles with everything from laundry disasters to navigating playground politics with other suburban moms. The entire comedy hinges on the concept that men are naturally incompetent at childcare and housework, with every punchline reinforcing the stereotype that fathers are basically overgrown children who can't figure out how washing machines work. Behind the scenes, Keaton was fighting an uphill battle with studio executives who doubted his ability to carry a major film, especially since his improvisational comedy style clashed with Terry Garr's more traditional approach, creating tension that director Stan Dragotti had to constantly manage during the modest $5 million production. The film's working with child actors created endless delays as Keaton tried to improvise around unpredictable kids, while technical scenes involving malfunctioning appliances required precision timing that often fell apart. What makes this movie a relic of its time is how it treats Jack's domestic struggles as inherently hilarious rather than a normal learning curve, while Caroline faces workplace sexual harassment that gets played for laughs instead of being recognized as the serious issue it actually represents. Conservative audiences were genuinely upset that the film showed a woman succeeding in business while her husband stayed home, viewing it as an attack on traditional family values. Overboard sounds like the setup to a psychological thriller, but somehow Hollywood convinced audiences it was a romantic comedy about a carpenter who kidnaps an amnesiac woman and gaslights her into believing she's his wife. Goldie Hawn plays Joanna Staten, a spoiled yacht-owning socialite who refuses to pay Kurt Russell's carpenter after he builds her a closet, so she pushes him overboard along with his tools. But karma strikes when she falls off the boat that same night and wakes up with total amnesia. Dean spots her story on the local news and decides the perfect revenge is convincing this vulnerable woman that she's actually his wife Annie, dragging her home to take care of his 4 unruly kids and do all the housework while he goes off to work. What's absolutely wild is that director Gary Marshall and the entire production team somehow thought this premise was charming instead of horrifying, with Han having to perform dangerous water stunts in freezing Oregon coastal waters, while the script asked audiences to root for a man who's literally holding a mentally incapacitated woman against her will. Behind the scenes, Han clashed with Russell over their different acting styles, demanding multiple takes to nail the comedic timing, while he preferred a more straightforward approach, creating tension that Marshall had to constantly mediate. The film sparked controversy even in the 80s, with feminist critics pointing out that the entire plot romanticizes manipulation and abuse, while teaching Joanna that her value comes from domestic servitude rather than her own agency. If someone pitched this story today, studio executives would probably call security, because essentially it's about a man who finds a woman with brain damage and decides to make her his unpaid housekeeper by lying about their relationship. 16 Candles made John Hughes a teen movie legend, but rewatching it today reveals a film that treats racist stereotypes and sexual assault like punchlines in what's supposed to be a heartwarming coming-of-age story. Molly Ringwald plays Sam Baker, a suburban Chicago sophomore whose family completely forgets her 16th birthday because they're too busy planning her sister's wedding, leaving Sam to navigate teenage crushes, social awkwardness, and the persistent advances of freshman Ted the Geek, while secretly pining for popular senior Jake Ryan. The real problem starts with Long Duk Dong, the Chinese exchange student played by Gede Watanabe, whose every scene is built around exaggerated accent work and fortune cookie wisdom that would get a screenwriter fired faster than you could say cultural sensitivity training. Behind the scenes, Hughes was juggling a cast of actual teenagers, including 16-year-old Ringwald, who was already becoming his muse, while Michael Schwafling's Jake Ryan casting involved him literally riding a motorcycle to his screen test. But the production had no idea they were creating what would become cinema's most controversial foreign exchange student character. What makes this movie a relic of its time is how casually it handles what we'd now recognize as serious issues, like when Jake essentially loans his unconscious drunk girlfriend to Ted for sexual purposes, treating her body like a party favor, while the script frames this as romantic problem-solving rather than assault. Hughes had to trim several scenes for the PG-13 rating, including extended sequences with Long Duk Dong that reportedly made his character even more offensive, plus various sexual jokes that were softened to maintain the film's accessibility to teenage audiences. The movie sparked backlash even in the 80s from parents and feminist critics who recognized that beneath the suburban sweetness was a story that normalized male entitlement and turned female agency into comedy gold. Conservative audiences were uncomfortable with the frank discussions of teenage sexuality, while progressive viewers were appalled by the racial caricatures and casual misogyny dressed up as high school hijinks. Mannequin turned the concept of the perfect woman into a literal object, and somehow Andrew McCare falling in love with a department store dummy became one of the weirdest romantic comedies of the Reagan era. The plot follows Jonathan Switcher, a struggling Philadelphia artist who discovers that one of his mannequin creations is actually inhabited by the spirit of an ancient Egyptian princess named Emmy, played by Kim Cattrall, who comes to life only when nobody else is watching and helps Jonathan design spectacular window displays that save the failing Prince & Company department store from bankruptcy. Here's what makes this movie a fascinating relic of 80s excess. The entire romantic premise is built around a woman who literally exists as a decorative object until a man's love gives her agency, which is basically every feminist critic's worst nightmare wrapped up in shoulder pads and synthesizer music. Behind the scenes, Andrew McCarthy was genuinely uncomfortable with the film's campy tone, having built his career on more serious indie dramas, and his creative conflicts with director Michael Gottlieb created tension throughout production, as they struggled to balance emotional sincerity with pure fantasy nonsense. The technical challenges were enormous, since McCarthy had to perform most of his scenes talking to an actual mannequin or off-camera stand-ins, requiring precise timing and multiple takes to sell the illusion that he was having romantic conversations with a piece of fiberglass. What's wild about this production is how it required complex lighting tricks and camera work to create Emmy's magical transformations on a shoestring budget, often during freezing Philadelphia winter nights, that made the elaborate choreographed sequences even more difficult to execute. The film sparked immediate backlash from feminist critics who pointed out that making your female lead a literal object who exists solely to inspire male creativity is pretty much the textbook definition of objectification dressed up as whimsical romance. Bachelor Party turned Tom Hanks into America's sweetheart by having him star in what's basically a feature-length advertisement for why women should never trust their fiancés around strippers and cocaine. The plot follows Rick Gasco, a Catholic school bus driver who's marrying the much classier Debbie Thompson, but his buddies decide to throw him the ultimate bachelor party, complete with sex workers, drugs, and enough debauchery to make Hugh Hefner blush, while Debbie's wealthy parents scheme to sabotage the wedding by enlisting her slimy ex-boyfriend Cole to tempt Rick into cheating. Here's what makes this movie a relic of Reagan-era excess. The entire comedy is built around the premise that getting married means you deserve one last night of consequence-free sexual adventure, treating infidelity like a rite of passage rather than a betrayal, while every woman who isn't the virgin bride gets reduced to either a nagging killjoy or a disposable sex object. Behind the scenes, the production was dealing with Tom Hanks' rising star power, as nervous producers wondered if audiences would accept him in such a raunchy role, especially since his character spends most of the movie being tempted by prostitutes in scenarios that required real brothel locations and actual sex workers as extras, creating legal headaches and safety concerns. Director Neil Israel had to balance the chaotic party sequences with complex choreography, especially during the climactic fight scene in a 36-screen movie theater, where Rick battles Cole while 3D films project around them. The film sparked immediate backlash from conservative groups who condemned its explicit sexual content and drug use, while feminist critics pointed out how every female character exists solely to either enable or obstruct male sexual gratification. Red Dawn turned teenage America's Cold War paranoia into the ultimate high school power fantasy, where Patrick Swayze and Charlie Sheen get to live out every suburban kid's dream of fighting Soviet invaders with hunting rifles and pure American grit. The plot follows a group of Colorado high school students who witness their small town get invaded by a coalition of Soviet, Cuban, and Nicaraguan forces during a fictional World War III, forcing brothers Jed and Matt Eckert along with their classmates to escape into the mountains and form a guerrilla resistance group called the Wolverines, who use their knowledge of local terrain to fight back against the occupation. Here's what makes this movie a fascinating time capsule of Reagan-era militarism. Director John Milius basically made a recruitment video disguised as a teen adventure film, with every scene designed to make audiences believe that communist invasion was not only possible but imminent, requiring American teenagers to be ready for armed resistance at any moment. Behind the scenes, the production was an absolute nightmare of logistical chaos, with crews battling unpredictable Colorado mountain weather while coordinating dangerous practical effects and real explosions that nearly killed several people, including a helicopter crash stunt that went horribly wrong and injured crew members, forcing major script rewrites. Patrick Swayze was constantly clashing with Milius over his character's development, demanding more emotional depth instead of just being a patriotic action hero. While Charlie Sheen faced criticism for his inexperience that created tension among the young cast, who were all struggling with the director's intense militaristic vision. What's wild about this production is how Milius insisted on using real military tactics and authentic weapons training, essentially turning his actors into actual guerrilla fighters while filming sequences that glorified teenage violence as heroic patriotism. The film sparked immediate controversy for its jingoistic propaganda and xenophobic portrayal of foreign invaders, with critics calling it dangerous fear-mongering during an already tense period of US-Soviet relations. The Wizard turned Nintendo's marketing department into Hollywood producers, creating what's essentially a 90-minute commercial for Super Mario Bros. 3, disguised as a heartwarming family road trip movie. The plot follows troubled teenager Jimmy Woods, who escapes from a group home with his brother Corey and friend Haley to compete in a video game championship in California, with Jimmy's prodigious Nintendo skills serving as their ticket to fame and fortune, while they dodge social services and navigate the emerging gaming culture of late 80s America. What makes this movie a perfect example of corporate synergy gone wild is how every single plot point exists solely to showcase Nintendo products, with the entire emotional arc of Jimmy's character development taking a backseat to extended gameplay sequences that function as interactive ads for upcoming game releases. Behind the scenes, the production was constantly battling tight deadlines to coordinate with Nintendo's marketing schedule for Super Mario Bros. 3, requiring careful licensing negotiations and promotional timing that often disrupted the actual filmmaking process, as director Todd Holland struggled to balance storytelling with product placement demands. Fred Savage was carrying the emotional weight of the story fresh off the Wonder Years, while Christian Slater was fighting for more character depth in what was essentially a feature-length infomercial, creating tension between the cast's dramatic ambitions and the film's commercial obligations. The movie sparked backlash from critics and parents who recognized it as blatant advertising targeted at children, raising concerns about the blurring lines between entertainment and marketing that would become increasingly relevant as digital media evolved. Conservative groups worried about promoting video game addiction among young audiences, while progressive critics pointed out how the film normalized runaway behavior and child independence as harmless adventure rather than addressing the serious risks involved.